Parents, teachers, guardians, and mentors. We can all agree you've got big shoes to fill, and it may feel like they're always getting bigger and more daunting. Welcome to Parenting Adventures, where we aim to be a beacon of support and knowledge for those navigating the complexities of parenting. Each episode, we bring on experts to walk us through the most pressing issues facing families, with evidence-based, practical strategies. And if school struggles are part of the puzzle, check out how Tutor Teach can help. Now, let's dive into the episode.
Have you ever wondered how boundaries impact your child's emotional development, or how to set limits that actually help your child thrive? I'm your host, Lara, and today we're thrilled to have Dr. Zia Lakdawalla with us. Dr. Lakdawalla is a clinical psychologist and the founder of Foundations for Emotional Wellness in Toronto. With a BA from McGill University and a PhD from the University of Illinois, Chicago, she's worked in a variety of mental health settings, including private practice and hospitals. In 2017, she founded Foundations for Emotional Wellness to help families navigate emotional challenges and build long-term resilience. In today's episode, we'll talk about Dr. Lakdawalla's journey to founding Foundations for Emotional Wellness, the critical role of boundaries in children's emotional growth, and why children are often secretly begging for limits. She'll also share practical tools for parents to improve their relationship with children, reduce behavioral issues, and support emotional health. Stay tuned, you won't want to miss it. Welcome to the podcast. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us. To start, I'd love to hear a bit about what led you to where you are today, serving as the Director of Foundations for Emotional Wellness. Was there a particular moment or experience that really solidified this path for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I have been a child psychologist. I work with children and adolescents. And as you know, I do a lot of parenting now. And I went into private practice on my own about 6 years ago. Prior to that, I had worked in community mental health and a number of different group practices. And the most recent group practice I was in was a practice where we were seeing kids who are doing a little bit more risky things. They were in adolescence and early adulthood. And in that was a pretty impactful experience for me. I was having little kids. I was thinking about parenting all the time. And I just became really curious about some of these kids who were really struggling in adolescence and early adulthood, and sort of how they came to be, struggling in this way, and what were they like as little people, and what was their environment like, and what was happening, and their temperament, and the interaction between their temperament and parenting. And I just sort of developed this passion around, like, how can we just work with parents and get in early in development, and think about the ways in which we could potentially shift the course for some of these kids if they're presenting in certain ways as little people. Can we get in there early and optimize the environment and really work with parents to maybe be as helpful as we can as early as we can. I also work with children and adolescents, and I sort of come by it honestly. My mom was a pediatrician and my dad was a psychiatrist. So there was, the intersection of these two fields is sort of where I landed.
I think it's so important to support parents, especially just as early as possible, because the journey of parenthood, and you and I were talking about this before we started recording, the journey of parenthood is not always easy to navigate. It's not linear, and there's more questions than answers. And so for parents to have the proper support is so paramount in what can feel like a very isolating role.
I think parents generally tend to parent the way that they were parented, right? And so a lot of the parents that we see that come to our practice and they're looking for support for their kids, they're doing the very best they can with the information that they have and the ways in which they were parented. And the parenting culture has actually shifted considerably from when we were kids to now, what it's like now. And some of those things are really tricky for parents to navigate, right? I think we live in a different culture where negative emotions feel more challenging and tricky for parents to navigate sometimes. I think parents are often sort of more fearful of doing some of the things that we're going to talk about today around setting boundaries and being, a little bit firmer with their children. And I really think that comes from a real genuine place of parents wanting to be connected to their kids, and be in good relationship with them long-term in their life. And I think it's also a reaction to a previous generation of parenting that was quite behavioral, right? And so, when you and I were kids, or maybe I'm a bit older than you, but when we were kids, our parents tended to be more behavioral in their approaches to parenting. And for the most part, that was okay. And for some of us, that didn't land in the way that we want to parent our kids. And so we're sort of in this, place of tension for how do we navigate these two worlds.
And it feels natural to say, this is what I loved about my childhood. This is what I didn't love about my childhood. So I want to pull this good stuff and leave that bad stuff. But how easy is it to really break those two apart? Where is their overlap? It's a tall order to really, and takes a lot of you have to be very introspective to go, now that I'm a parent, I can relate to this part of how my parents parented me, I suppose, but this seems odd. It's a really big inner dialogue that happens once you become a parent.
It is. The inner dialogue is probably one of the most important parts about thinking about this and self-reflection and, what comes up for me when my kids get dysregulated, when I have to go and set a boundary, or I have to say a no, or they're anxious to go into class on the first day of school. What actually is happening in a parent's body. And it's one thing, I run a lot of groups in my practice. I do a lot of parent work. It's not a knowing problem, right? Like it's easy to know the information. The tricky part comes when you're in the moment and you have to do some of these things. And that's a lot of the work that I get into with the families that we work with, around how can we sort of remove some of these boundaries and understand your job as a parent, and how do we set our kids up for success in the long term, when sometimes that makes it really tricky and uncomfortable in the short term.
Mm-hmm. So boundaries can sometimes feel like a bit of a buzzword in parenting, but they play such a huge role in emotional development and regulation. Why are boundaries so crucial for kids, especially in the long term?
Yeah, it's a really big question. And I don't have a very succinct answer for it. So let me back up for a second. If we think about how kids learn to regulate their emotions generally come in a wave. Something happens, emotions peak at a certain point, they escalate, they peak, and then they come back down to baseline, right? And that sort of process is really important for humans to experience. It's important for them to go through the full wave of the emotion. And we know that's true for long-term emotional development, right? And sometimes when we go to set boundaries with kids, they have big reactions to these moments, right? And so we go to say a no, or, I'm only reading one book before bed, or you can't have your sister's toy, or whatever it might be. And kids have reactions to that, as they should, right? Kids are not born regulated. They're building these skills, and we are their teachers to learn how to regulate themselves. And so when they have reactions to those things, if you think about that in terms of the wave, they get dysregulated. How a parent responds to that dysregulation becomes really important, right? If parents, again, all with the very best of intentions, doing the best they can, comes from a place of, really wanting to support their child. If parents are getting frustrated with their kids in moments of dysregulation, that has messaging for the wave of emotion. If parents are folding on some of their boundaries, that also has implications for a child's ability to tolerate frustration and to regulate frustration. So really, boundaries are everywhere. If we think about what happens in the world, there's so many no's that our kids are going to encounter. And I'm a big believer that the key developmental task of childhood, one of them, is really being able to know that there's a boundary, know that that boundary is completely immovable. There's nothing you can do about that. And then to move yourself, to get frustrated, to move yourself through that wave of emotion, and then to know that you can handle it. You're not going to fall apart. Your parents are not going to fall apart. Boundaries are okay, and you can get upset about them and then move beyond them, right? And so that task in childhood is really the muscle. It's building the strength, it's building the training in the muscles, so that when you're a teenager and you get broken up with, or you don't get your first job, or you studied hard for a test and it didn't come back the way you wanted you can manage, you can handle adversity, right? And that strength training comes in childhood, and it really comes in a dyadic relationship with a parent on how their ability to set a boundary, hold a boundary, stay firm to it, but also to co-regulate with their child as they move through it.
So when you're talking boundaries, can you define exactly what that means in the sense of a parent supporting a child?
For sure. So a boundary is something that actually it's only based on a parent behavior, right? So we actually are not requiring anything of a child when we talk about boundaries. This is really just what the parent chooses to do, right? So I will not read you a third book tonight. You can't have that cookie before dinner, right? I'm not accompanying you to the bathroom, right? Those kinds of things where it's based on parent behavior, that's what we call a boundary. And sometimes when kids get dysregulated, they're at the peak of that emotion. When they're at the peak of that emotion, they push those boundaries, right? And that's their job, right? A child's job is to push the environment. Is it going to stay there? Is it not going to stay there? What's going to happen if I push a little bit harder? And if the boundary moves, that's not comfortable for kids. It feels like, what is happening here? Who's in control? What is going on, right? We want those boundaries to be sturdy and firm, but we're not really attached to the compliance or how your child or what your child does about it. Sure, of course, we want to support them. We want the parent to stay regulated, to validate. It's so frustrating when I say you only have one book, right? I know you really want that cookie. You're so hungry and dinner's not ready yet, right? To validate and to get in there with them, but it doesn't mean you have to change what you're going to do, right? And sometimes parents get anxious. I do too with my kids. I set a boundary, no video games, or, we're not going to do this thing, or I say something like that. My kids get upset. It's not fun. It's not pleasant. I find it dysregulating myself. And so that physiology that happens in me, that's my job. That's my work to work on that part, because I know with my therapist hat on, not necessarily my mom hat, my therapist hat, that in the long term, these things are really important for them.
It's a good way to look at it, to say, like, this isn't for me, it's for them. But when you break those boundaries, it feels like it's for yourself, because, we all have a threshold. And I'm just like picturing, even just yesterday, the kids asking for snack after they already got their snacks. And you're like, no, now it's bedtime. And it's hard not to break, because then you feel a level of guilt of, well, what if they're actually truly still hungry and they didn't get enough? Or is this just a tactic to delay their bedtime? And you start going through all these scenarios, choose your own adventure of what's happening. And then you break down, okay, just for tonight, okay, I'll give you that extra snack. But then what we just did was show a weakness in our boundaries, and then they know that they can do it again. And that is really, it's hard to be put up against in the moment.
Very hard.
Yeah.
It is hard. And I also think it's important to note that, like, we all fold on our boundaries sometimes. We're human, right? Like, we're not going to get it right every time. And flexibility is something we also want to encourage in our kids. But we're talking about broad patterns of behavior, right? If you're a parent who, has difficulty consistently maintaining boundaries, that's tricky, right? That doesn't set your child up in the long term to be able, they don't have the practice. They just don't have the muscle, right? If we do it once in a while, you're up late, you're tired, you want an extra snack, okay, fine, right? But we just don't want that to be your general pattern of responding. When a child's dysregulated, if they can dysregulate the environment, if they can change things in the environment, it's too much power, it's too much control. They actually don't like that. Right? We think that we're giving them what they want, but they actually don't really like that. They really actually want the containment. They want to know that the frustration can be contained. It's normal. It's okay. People get frustrated. And then we want to move them through, that's okay. We come back down the other side of the curve.
I think parents will be happy to hear that it's okay. Also, just for our kids to see that we don't always get it right also, and that's not normal.
It's actually not good for kids for us to get it right all the time. Kids don't need a perfect parent. They need a fallible parent who sometimes makes mistakes, can come back around and repair, but for the most part has the intention and can maintain some consistency in how they're going to show up for that child.
Absolutely. So I love your blog post about how kids are secretly begging for limits. And you kind of just touched on that. So that really struck me, because on the surface, it can seem like kids are fighting against boundaries rather than wanting them. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, along the lines of what I just said. So this is sort of like the resilience training, right? We're asking kids to act, and sometimes parents are like, well, they can't handle a no, or what if they get really dysregulated, and parents are tiptoeing around their child's emotion. They haven't had enough training and they haven't had enough practice. Right. And so that sort of secretly begging part is really about, if I think about what that looks like and the trajectory long term. And, I've had the fortune of working with kids across the developmental span. I've seen what happens, right? When kids can't tolerate a no, it's very difficult for them to function in a way that the world works, right? Sometimes your friends are not going to want to hang out with you. You may not get invited to a birthday party. And if they haven't had that, it makes it very difficult in the long term, right? There's really interesting research around the idea of, how important a wall of futility is for a child. And this sort of transition from frustration of not getting what you want, anger, fighting, yelling, saying unkind things when kids push, the transition from that emotion of frustration to sadness, right, to drawing out tears is a really important transition. And there's actually something about the chemical composition of those types of tears that's different from any type of tear a human cries, right? Which is, they call them tears of futility. This is Gordon Neufeld's work. I think it's so fascinating that it's that important of a tear, that developmental task of moving from frustration to tears is so critical. And we want to try to be able to do that for our kids, right? When we say a no, you want to get down on the kitchen floor and say, like, I know you really wanted that thing. And we want them to come crawl into our arms so we can soothe them when they're sad, right? That's sort of the beautiful process of that happening. Does it always happen like that? No, it probably doesn't, but that's sort of what we're after, right? Is like a wall of futility that's not movable. And then we're going to support them to get through it.
How would you address a child who knows how to accept boundaries outside of the household, but not inside of the household, or vice versa? Perhaps they're very good in the household, but not out of the household. How does that work?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So I would say the most common presentation of families that we see in our practice is kids who are delightful and they're well regulated at school and their teachers love them. And if their teachers knew what was happening at home, they would be shocked. Most parents say things like that. That's the most common presentation. It's unusual for a child to have a lot of struggles at school and to not translate back to home, right? But you see the opposite quite often, where kids are having difficulty at home. And, if we think about a school environment, extracurricular environments, those are very sturdy environments, right? Teachers are predictable. They show up in a certain way every day. The rules are clear, right? Where everybody sits is clear. What happens? What is the timeline? If you do X, here's what will happen, right? Everything is very clear and transparent. And there's like behaviorism at play there that is actually very, I think, containing to a lot of kids. At home, sometimes that's not the case, right? And so that's where that parent work and a lot of the work that we do in our clinic comes in, where we really try to identify, with the very best of intentions, there is something about that child-parent dynamic where parents may be attending to the wrong thing. Sometimes parents are always attending to non-compliance, right? What we pay attention to tends to repeat itself, right? Sometimes parents are getting very angry or frustrated with their child's pushing and non-compliance or pushing back on boundaries, and they're angry and upset. And there's something about that parent-child relationship that is fractured for a period of time. And, we're talking about boundaries and behaviorism. For me, the most important thing in parenting is the connection you have with your child, right? And it's the relationship, it's the good feelings that you generate in each other when you're around each other. And so when that really gets compromised, sometimes you can see parents get into a cycle where, a child gets dysregulated, a parent is trying to help with the best of intentions, but it actually is somehow either invalidating the child or increasing the likelihood that there's dysregulation. So we spend a lot of time with parents really trying to think about, what are the nuances of what's happening here? When they get upset, what happens to you in your body, right? And how can we, we don't want parents to be sturdy and firm and behavioral like a school. We want them to maintain, their style and their warmth. But there may be some ways in there to shift some of these things so that kids are getting the right messages in these moments.
And in school, it's like you go in on the first day and they say, well, here's where you're sitting, here's the expectations and the rules of the classroom. Or same if they're in a sport or an extracurricular activity, it's like, this is what you're working with and this is what you must follow. Whereas at home, that's not as doable because things shake up the household all the time. But I imagine too, getting the parents to be on the same page, if they're in a dual parent, like if both their parents are still together, or in a dual parent household, there's so many dynamics with family. We just had
so many. There's like a million variables.
Yeah,
yes.
There are. And like we just had a therapist on the last season who talked about divorce and how that affects a child's boundaries and how one parent might set different expectations up than the other parent, and then you look at parents under the same household, and sometimes they don't agree because we all come from totally different worlds, like we weren't brought up the same way. And so it's just, I mean, you've got your work set for life because this just doesn't stop.
Yeah, I mean, and we see a lot of that, right? Where one parent has a relationship with a child that maybe feels more strained, another feels like it's more cohesive, or they have different styles of responding to their child. One works better than the other, or they both work equally well in different ways. It's like there's so many variables at play. But what we truly try to work with parents around is understanding the framework. Like, what is your job as a parent? You're going to have different styles. One's going to be really funny. And like my husband's like, jokes with my kids a lot and injects humor into everything. And another parent has a different style. But if we understand the principles around emotion regulation and really what we're trying to build in them, we're operating from the same principles, right? And that's really what we strive to like communicate to parents.
That's really important work. And again, like I think parents need a little bit of a safety net and an understanding ear, because sometimes we don't even know where the problems are coming from. And if we could get a little bit more granular in that, it would be easier to navigate a solution in the everyday kind of strife that can happen in a household, because parenting's a hard job and kids can be unpredictable. They can be happy and ticking along, and then all of a sudden something happened and they're not so willing. Or like you said, some kids don't like the word no, or they don't like the boundaries. And so it's easier at times to give in, and then that's actually not what they want. And so it's just, there's so much rhetoric to this.
It is. And I think it's really hard for parents, especially like if you have two working parents or even not. If you like, I think life is just busy. Kids are in a lot of activities. There's a lot of driving around to different places, and parents are feeling stretched and their resources are low a lot of the time to actually have what we call, a wise mind, and to really think about a mindful approach to parenting. It sounds like a little bit of a dream to be able to be mindful in how you're going to parent on the go. And when you've got like 4 kids like yourself at home, or 3 kids like me, it's like, it feels like a whirlwind, right? And I think there's so many different things that can draw our attention away from this dynamic and this parent-child relationship. And, it's what parenting is. It's like we're doing the best we can, and there's always room for us to do better.
I always say, from the second my eyes open, if they ever shut overnight, from the second they open till the second I actually get a chance to go back to sleep, it's like I don't know what happened in between. It's go, go, go in every capacity possible. Parents are superhuman. I'm convinced that parents are superhuman, because it just doesn't stop. It doesn't stop emotionally, mentally, physically. It's always go, go, go. Especially like, I mean, for me, I'm just speaking from having 4 kids. There's always a child that requires my support and my attention. And it's a crazy ride, but I wouldn't change it for anything.
And Lara, if you bring that back to this idea of boundaries, right? You have to have resources to be able to set these things. It is actually way easier in the short term for a parent to just be like, just fine, just take the cookie, like it's way easier to do that. And if you don't have the resources to actually get ready to sit on the kitchen floor with your kid and to ride out this wave, and sometimes that wave for parents who don't have the practice doing this, what happens over time is it's harder and harder for kids to tolerate, right? That wave is big now, and once you go to try to set those things, whenever you change something in a system, there's a predictable pattern that happens. Things get worse before they get better, right? Kids have a big response to those things, and you have to be ready for that. And that's where the consistency becomes really important, right? When sometimes parents feel like, okay, I'm going to go and try to work this muscle and build this muscle in my kids. And then they're like, yeah, but they get so upset about it, and they don't follow through. And then the parent gets upset and they're like, no, this isn't working for us. And it's just consistency. The more predictable parents are and consistent in what the approach is going to be, kids do eventually come alongside, right? And they like that. It feels comfortable for them, but it does require the parent to have resource to stick with it.
So for the parents who are listening who are like, man, this is great advice, but my kid's 7, 9, maybe 12, 14. It's probably too late for me to start creating boundaries. What would you say to them?
It's never too late. It's never, ever too late. And it's so, so worth it. These are little people and they're oriented towards you. They are there, and that's what attachment is. It's survival. Kids have an orientation towards their parent, and even if it's strained and parents feel like, I don't have a good relationship with my child, this is like evolution. Your kids are wired to want to be connected to you. And so it's never too late to really think about how do you increase the warmth in your relationship, right? So we're trying to do two things: maintain your connection and increase your warmth and stay connected to your kids, and at the same time, increase your firmness and your boundaries, right? So those two things together, warmth and firmness, if you look at all of the parenting literature that's out there, the very best outcomes come from parents who are both kind, warm, and they're also firm and sturdy.
A good balance of firm and fun and everything in between. No, that's
right.
Yeah, like you said, not super easy, but doable.
Yeah.
For those listening who want to learn more about your work and your foundation, where can they go to do that?
So we are located in Toronto, on the east end of Toronto, and we service all of Ontario. We do see children and adolescents only in person in the office. And that's just my preference and experience, and having worked with kids through COVID. I really think if kids are going to access therapy, we should be seeing them in the office in person and really giving them a good therapy experience so that they will come to see it as something that can be helpful and that they'll want to access whenever they need to. And then we see parents. We do a lot of parenting groups for parents of anxious kids, and parents of emotionally intense children is a big focus of our practice. And we run those virtually, and we do a lot of parent work virtually as well. And you can find us on our website at www.ffew.ca. And we have an Instagram account as well where you can follow us.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. I think that parents can take away a lot from just this conversation, but they should definitely head over to your content, your website, and your socials to get some more tips and tricks and realize that we're all together in this. We're not alone, and we all have a tinge of feeling the same way about how to set those boundaries, and are we doing enough? Are we not doing enough? And I think that you brought a lot of insight into this topic. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Parenting Adventures. Thanks for listening. We hope it gives you that extra bit of confidence that you need to conquer the road ahead. And if you're looking for academic support to ensure your kids thrive in school, visit tutorteach.ca to learn how we're here for families just like yours. We'll see you in the next episode.